SM U-Boat 16 was a transitional design in the Imperial German Navy's early submarine development. It was a single prototype built for comparative testing against the preceding U-Boat 13 class, and it included improvements that influenced the later U-Boat 17 type. Built by Germania Werft in Kiel, it was the only vessel of its kind completed. It featured a double-hulled construction to improve its ocean-going capability and stability in rough seas. Designed by naval architect Hans Teckel, the submarine had a cylindrical pressure hull surrounded by large ballast tanks, with a flat deck on top to help the crew move around and improve seaworthiness. Teckel used the lessons learned from the hull of U-Boat 16 in later designs. After World War I, when the Treaty of Versailles banned Germany from building submarines, he helped establish the Engineers Contour for Scheepsbouw, or IVS, in The Hague. This Dutch engineering office allowed German naval architects to quietly continue their submarine design work for foreign navies during the interwar period. The submarine displaced 539 tons when surfaced and 691 tons submerged. This compact but tough build was perfect for coastal and short-range operations. It had an overall length of 190 feet, a beam of almost 20 feet, and a draft of 11 feet. Its maximum test depth was 164 feet, which was much deeper than the 98-foot limit of the earlier U-Boat 9 class submarines. Propulsion came from two shafts driven by four cording two-stroke gasoline engines on the surface, including two 6-cylinder units and two 8-cylinder units. These delivered a total of 1,200 horsepower. For submerged running, it used two SSW electric motors that produced 1,100 horsepower. This setup gave the submarine a surface speed of 15.6 knots and a submerged speed of 10.7 knots. It had a range of 4,500 nautical miles at 9 knots when surfaced, or 90 nautical miles at 5 knots when submerged. Relying on gasoline engines was a step toward standardization, unlike the mixed fuel systems used in older designs, although diesel engines would replace them in later classes. Its armament included four 17.7-inch torpedo tubes, 2 in the bow and 2 in the stern. These were loaded with 6 C-06 torpedoes. Each torpedo carried a 270-pound TNT warhead and could reach targets up to 9,800 feet away at 26 knots. Initially, a single 1.5-inch Hotchkiss revolver cannon was mounted on the deck for surface combat and defense. During World War I, this was upgraded to a 2-inch SKL-40 gun in early 1915, and then to a 4.1-inch SKL-45 gun later that year for even more firepower. The crew consisted of 35 personnel, including 4 officers and 31 enlisted men, who operated in a tight but efficient space. The total construction cost was $2,539,000 gold marks, highlighting the experimental nature of this pre-war prototype. The gradual upgrading of the deck gun reflected a larger trend among the early U-boats of the Kaiserliche Marine. Commanders increasingly preferred using gunfire instead of torpedoes against lightly defended merchant ships. Artillery shells were much more plentiful than the limited supply of just 6 torpedoes, allowing the crew to save their torpedoes for warships or heavily laden targets. SM U-Boat 16 was ordered on August 26, 1909, as part of the Imperial German Navy's early submarine development program. It was built by Friedrich Krupp Germania Werft in Kiel, Germany. At the time, Germania Werft was one of only a few German shipyards licensed and equipped to build submarines, having already delivered several of the Navy's first U-boats. Over the course of the war, this shipyard would go on to build significantly more submarines for the Kaiserliche Marine than any other single facility. The keel of U-Boat 16 was laid down on May 10, 1910, and the boat was launched on August 29, 1911. Following sea trials, the submarine officially joined the fleet on December 28. As one of the pre-war U-boats of the Kaiserliche Marine, U-Boat 16 was a prototype. It was built to test and improve seaworthiness before mass production began during the First World War. The prefix SM stood for Seiner Majestat, meaning His Majesty, and Unterseeboot indicated the type of vessel. Right after commissioning, SMU Boat 16 joined the Imperial German Navy. There, it helped develop submarine tactics in the years before the First World War. As one of the first ocean-going submarines, it was primarily used for training and experiments from 1911 to 1914. The crew honed their skills in the Baltic and North Seas. When the war began on August 1, 1914, SMU Boat 16 was transferred to the 2nd U-boat flotilla of the Kaiserliche Marine in the North Sea. This marked the transition from peacetime training to actual combat. The boat was assigned to reconnaissance and defensive patrols against the British fleet. Under the command of Kapitän Lieutenant Klaus Hansen, the crew prepared for battle, focusing on scouting missions to track British ships. SMU Boat 16 took part in the First Battle of the Atlantic as part of the 1st Submarine Reconnaissance Flotilla. On August 6, 1914, it departed from Helgoland alongside U-Boat 5, U-Boat 7, U-Boat 8, U-Boat 9, U-Boat 13, U-Boat 14, U-Boat 15, U-Boat 17, and U-Boat 18. This was the first independent combat patrol without escort ships. The objective was to scout British naval forces in the North Sea, in waters controlled by the Grand Fleet. The group headed north, and by August 12th, SMU Boat 16 had safely returned to Germany. During this early sortie, the reconnaissance went off without engaging the enemy. In total during the war, this U-boat completed 4 patrols, where the main goal was reconnaissance and preparation for future combat in the region. The U-Boat 16 was commanded by 2 officers during the First World War. Kapitän Lieutenant Klaus Hansen was the commander from August 1, 1914 to March 15, 1915. He led the submarine's first combat operations. After him, command was taken over by Oberleutnant zur See Leo Hillebrand. He commanded the boat from March 16 to October 21, 1915, and received the Royal House Order of Hohenzollern for his service. In total, this U-boat completed 4 combat patrols. They mostly took place in the North Sea, where the first German U-boats carried out reconnaissance and solitary attacks on merchant vessels. The patrols lasted anywhere from 1 to several weeks between August 1914 and October 1915. For example, during one of its first patrols under the command of Hansen, U-Boat 16 slipped undetected into Lerwick Harbor in the Shetland Islands for reconnaissance. This sortie proved so important that after the war it was remembered as one of the most iconic patrols, demonstrating the true capabilities of the early submarine fleet. It was ranked right up there with the breakthrough of U-Boat 18 through the Strait of Dover to Scapa Flow and the journey of U-Boat 20 around the British Isles. In late November 1914, British spotters sighted U-Boat 16 in the waters around the Orkney Islands. This forced the British Admiralty to temporarily move its Grand Fleet from the still poorly defended anchorage at Scapa Flow to safer ports on the east coast of Scotland. The results of these patrols were mixed. The boat successfully disrupted enemy shipping, but its capabilities were limited by a short cruising range and endurance compared to later models. During these missions, U-Boat 16 sank 11 merchant vessels totaling 11,730 tons displacement, damaged 2 more vessels with a combined weight of 11,228 tons, and captured 1 vessel as a prize, weighing 838 tons. This made a solid contribution to the early German commerce raiding strategy. As one of nearly 380 U-boats that entered the German fleet during the war, U-Boat 16 was a prime example of how quickly the submarine fleet grew, having started with just 20 combat submarines in 1914. However, its combat career came to an end in October 1915. This coincided with a temporary halt to unrestricted submarine warfare in the North Sea for political reasons, as well as the arrival of newer U-boat models. After its final combat patrol in late 1915, U-Boat 16 was pulled from offensive operations and converted into a training vessel for new recruits. Right up until the armistice in November 1918, it was used to practice tactics, navigation, and submarine handling. The fleet was busy building new U-boats and needed well-trained crews, making older models like U-Boat 16 perfect for safe training in home waters. U-Boat 16 kicked off its raiding career in February 1915 with a series of successful attacks in the North Sea. The boat targeted Allied merchant vessels with torpedoes to cut off supply lines. On February 15th, under the command of Klaus Hansen, the submarine sank the British steamer Dulwich with a displacement of 3,289 tons and the French steamer Ville de Lille at 997 tons, one right after the other. This perfectly showcased the effectiveness of stealthy submerged torpedo attacks. On February 18th, U-Boat 16 damaged the French steamer Denora, weighing 4,208 tons, and the very next day, the Norwegian tanker Belridge at 7,020 tons, forcing both vessels to fall back for repairs. In May 1915, now under the command of Leo Hillebrand, U-Boat 16 began an aggressive offensive in the North Sea. From May 26th to May 30th, the U-boat sank 4 merchant vessels with precise torpedo strikes along Allied and neutral shipping routes. Among its successes were the Swedish sailing ship M. Roswall of 309 tons and the Danish steamer Betty of 2,109 tons, both sunk on May 26th. Later, on May 28th, the Russian sailing ship Mars of 251 tons went to the bottom, followed on May 30th by the Danish steamer Soborg of 2,108 tons. These attacks highlighted the role of the submarine in escalating the German trade war, as destroying small coastal vessels dealt a serious blow to enemy logistics. The highest activity for U-Boat 16 occurred in September and October 1915. During that time in the North Sea, the boat sank several Scandinavian merchant ships. To avoid detection by patrols, the crew used the tactic of quick torpedo strikes and immediate withdrawal. Under the command of Leo Hillebrand, the Danish steamer Thorvaldsen, with a displacement of 1,220 tons, was sunk on September 20th. By the end of the month, several more small Danish and Norwegian sailing ships went to the bottom, including Ellen Benson, Flora, Acti, and the barge Florida. On October 1st, the crew captured the Swedish steamer Pallas as a prize. Its displacement was 838 tons. These actions perfectly demonstrated the main goal of U-Boat 16, namely the interception of merchant vessels. Overall, during its patrols, this U-boat sank or captured 12 ships with a total displacement of over 12,500 tons and damaged 2 more vessels totaling 11,228 tons. All these events took place over just 4 combat patrols from February to October under the command of Klaus Hansen and Leo Hillebrand. During this time, the boat never once engaged in combat with warships. The choice of targets reflected the overall strategy of submarine warfare at the time, which was to cut Allied supply lines. Out of the 14 affected vessels, 8 belonged to neutral Scandinavian countries like Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Despite their neutral status, many of them carried cargo necessary for the Allied war effort. Direct losses also included 1 British, 1 Russian, and 2 French ships. This increased the pressure on the merchant fleet at the beginning of the unrestricted submarine warfare campaign, although the scale was relatively modest compared to the later achievements of U-boat aces. After the October patrol of 1915, the submarine ceased combat operations. After the armistice on November 11, 1918, the Imperial German Navy decommissioned U-Boat 16. The boat was to be handed over to Britain as war reparations under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. On February 8, 1919, the empty submarine was being towed to the port of Harwich. However, on the way, it sank near Shawhorn Island in the Wadden Sea. This happened at around 1300 hours. The likely cause was a water leak or damage to the hull during towing. Although there are theories that the boat was intentionally scuttled to avoid handing it over to the victors. The wreck settled in shallow water at a depth of about 65 feet, where the hull became partially embedded in the muddy bottom under the influence of strong tidal currents. Since no one was on board, there were no casualties. Local authorities immediately marked the site as a hazard to navigation, but due to the difficult conditions, they were unable to raise the submarine at the time. The salvage operation for the wreck of U-Boat 16 only began in 2025. The main reason was that the U-boat lay in a busy shipping lane of the Elbe River, where changes in the channel created serious risks for passing ships. At a depth of 65 feet near the island of Scharhorn, sonar detected scouring on the seabed near the bow and stern. Because of strong currents, the wreck could shift and become a threat to other vessels. German maritime authorities managed the operation. They classified the site as a standard underwater obstacle that had to be removed, since the boat did not have the status of a war grave. Prep work started in late August 2025. A specialized vessel cleared the silt around the hull so divers could pull lifting cables underneath it. Work vessels were held securely in place by anchors with light buoys. To carry out the lift, the heavy floating crane Matador 3 arrived at the port of Cuxhaven on August 27th. Its dimensions were about 236 feet long and 105 feet wide. The salvage operation itself took place overnight from August 31st to September 1st. Along with the Dutch crane, 2 tugboats were brought in. Steel cables were carefully guided under the U-boat's 187-foot hull, but due to heavy corrosion after 106 years on the bottom, the structure broke apart during the lift. It was initially reported to be in 2 pieces, but it later turned out there were 3. On September 2nd, the bow section was loaded onto pontoons and sent to port, while the stern remained on the seabed for the next stage of the operation. A convoy escorted by 3 local tugboats, namely Wolf 5, Wolf 7, and Wolf 9, headed out to the wreck site around 4:30 in the afternoon. The trip took about 2.5 hours. The lift was finished around 11 at night, after which the vessels headed back. The second, larger section of the hull, along with the conning tower, was recovered a few days later. The operation took place without an official excavation permit from the German government, which usually handles property of the former Imperial Navy. Because the object had been listed on charts for over 60 years without protected monument status, the local waterways authority simply declared it abandoned property. As a result, the remains of the submarine were brought ashore in pieces. Because of the terrible condition of the metal, preserving or displaying the hull as a single exhibit was impossible. They decided to scrap most of the parts, including safely disposing of the onboard batteries. However, smaller parts, like a hatch cover, caught the attention of museums and private collectors. No ammo or human remains were found on board, so specialists could focus entirely on safe dismantling without any complications. Over the following weeks, officials decided the future of the discovery. About a quarter of the recovered hull was deemed fit for preservation, despite the heavily damaged outer plating. These fragments were divided among several German museums, and the rest was scrapped. The largest surviving pieces were handed over to a private technology museum in the town of Beneckenstein. These included the midsection of the hull with the conning tower and bridge components, a periscope, one of the 2 8-cylinder kerosene engines, as well as the stern section with 2 torpedo tubes, the port propeller, and the steering gear. The director of this museum had long dreamed of getting a complete U-boat for his exhibition, so he acted instantly as soon as the wreckage was brought to the surface. Transporting the entire hull would have cost over 1 million euros, which was totally out of reach for the museum. Smaller finds, including other torpedo tubes and an access hatch, went on display at the Windstark 10 Maritime Museum in Cuxhaven. Additionally, the fragments that ended up in Beneckenstein were filmed for a documentary series on the D-Max channel called Steel Titans. Raising this submarine sparked a major controversy among archaeologists and historians. They saw the operation as pure destruction that violated every possible procedure. There was no proper documentation, no preliminary research, and no professional oversight. It was a direct violation of standard rules. Critics, including Jens Auer from the Commission for Underwater Archaeology, called it an absolute disaster and an unnecessary move. He suggested simply relocating the intact hull to another spot. That would have been a lot safer than raising it to the surface. But the authorities ignored that idea and decided to pull the submarine out completely. Underwater archaeologist Florian Huber backed this up. He called the actions illegal and said it was a missed opportunity to preserve the submarine in its original location, just like they do with other World War I vessels. The chief archaeologist of Hamburg, Rainer Maria Weiss, went even further. He described the operation as an illegal and rushed move carried out on Hamburg territory without any involvement from his department. Critics also pointed out that under German rules, before doing something like this, you absolutely must notify heritage protection agencies and have a clear excavation plan. On top of that, you need to consult with the German War Graves Commission to make sure there are no human remains inside. But the responsible authorities themselves later admitted that not a single one of these steps was taken before they started raising the submarine.